let us pass over my return to the camp just as the sun was beginning to set. Scattered patches of smoke hung in the still evening air. It was quiet, as if everyone in the troop was listening for something, as if they were all holding their breath. An idle wind tussled the leaves in the trees and wafted a patch of smoke like a low cloud toward me. I stepped out of the forest and through the smoke, heading into the camp. I left the cloud of smoke and rubbed some of the sting from my eyes. The sight of bodies strewn about like broken dolls, the smell of blood and burning hair. How I wandered aimlessly about, too disoriented for proper panic, numb with shock and dread. As I looked around, I saw Tripp's tent lying half-collapsed and smoldering in his fire. The treated canvas burned fitfully, and the acrid gray smoke hung close to the ground in the quiet evening air. I saw Taryn's body lying by his wagon, his sword broken in his hand. One of his legs was twisted unnaturally, and the splintered bone showing through the skin was very, very white. I stood, unable to look away from Taryn, the gray shirt, the red blood, the white bone. I stared as if it were a diagram in a book I was trying to understand. Some small rational part of me realized I was in deep shock. It repeated the fact to me again and again. I used all my master training to ignore it. I did not want to think about what I saw. I did not want to know what had happened here. I did not want to know what any of this meant. After I don't know how long, a wisp of smoke broke my line of vision. I sat down next to the nearest fire in a daze. It was Shandi's fire, and a small pot hung simmering, boiling potatoes, strangely familiar among the chaos. Her clothes hung in tatters about her. I tried to brush her hair away from her face, and my hand came back sticky with blood. The firelight reflected in her flat, empty eyes. I stood and looked about aimlessly. Tripp's tent was entirely aflame by now, and Shandy's wagon was standing with one wheel in Marion's campfire. All the flames were tinged with blue, making the scene dreamlike and surreal. I heard voices. Peering around the corner of Shandy's wagon, I saw several unfamiliar men and women sitting around a fire. My parents' fire. A dizziness swept over me, and I reached out a hand to steady myself against the wagon's wheel. When I gripped it, the iron bands that reinforced the wheel crumbled in my hand, flaking away in gritty sheets of brown rust. I now stood in full view of the fire. One of the men tumbled backward and came to his feet with his sword out. His motion reminded me of quicksilver rolling from a jar onto a tabletop, effortless and supple. His expression was intent, but his body was relaxed, as if he had just stood and stretched. His sword was pale and elegant. When it moved, it cut the air with a brittle sound. It reminded me of the quiet that settles on the coldest days in winter when it hurts to breathe. His face was narrow and sharp, with the perfect beauty of porcelain. His hair was shoulder length, framing his face in loose curls the color of frost. He was a creature of winter's pale. Everything about him was cold and sharp and white, except his eyes. They were black, like a goat's, but with no iris. His eyes were like his sword, and neither one reflected the light of the fire or the setting sun. He relaxed when he saw me. He dropped the tip of his sword and smiled with perfect ivory teeth. It was the expression a nightmare wore.
What's your name, boy?
I stood there, mute, frozen as a startled fawn. When he looked back up at me, I saw pity staring at me with hollow eyes.
Young man,
where are your parents?
He held my gaze for a moment and then looked over his shoulder back toward the fire where the others sat.
Does anyone know where his parents are?
Some of them smiled, hard and brittle, as if enjoying a particularly good joke.
Is this your parents' fire? Some's parents have been singing entirely the wrong sort of songs.
Cinder.
A cool voice came from the direction of the fire. The black eyes of Cinder narrowed in irritation.
You are approaching my displeasure. This one has done nothing. Send him to the soft and painless blanket of his sleep.
The cool voice caught slightly on the last word as if it were difficult to say. The voice came from a man who sat apart from the rest, wrapped in shadow at the edge of the fire. Shadow pooled around him like thick oil. The fire snapped and danced, lively and warm, tinged with blue, but no flicker of its light came close to him.
You seem to forget get a purpose? Or does your purpose simply differ from my own?
No, of course not. Lord Helic, please forgive me.
There was an expectant silence. Those sitting around the fire grew perfectly still, their expressions intent. In unison, they tilted their heads as if looking at the same point in the twilight sky, as if trying to catch the scent of something on the wind.
They come.
Haliak said quietly. He stood, and shadow seemed to boil outward from him like a dark fog. Haliak spread his arms, and the shadow surrounding him bloomed like a flower unfolding. Then each of the others turned with a studied ease and took a step toward Haliak's, into the shadow surrounding him. They faded away. Then I began to play. My fingers hurt, but I played anyway. I played until my fingers bled on the strings. I played until the sun shone through the trees. I played until my arms ached. I played, trying not to remember, until I fell asleep.
Do you want to know the full story? How did all this happen? Here I leave you the window to the full video. If you want to know more about the story of Kvothe, the King Killer, I invite you to like and subscribe so you will support the content and be aware of the updates. Take care.